Thank you, everybody. It's fantastic to be back in the Netherlands. My daughter's studying in The Hague at the moment, so I welcome any excuse to come over. And I'd like to thank VBDO, ICCO, PricewaterhouseCoopers and CNV International for inviting me to speak at your third conference on business and human rights here in the Netherlands. A very valuable marker for progress towards making human rights a reality in business practice. Now, my own organisation, the Institute for Human Rights in Business, we call ourselves a think and do tank. And the tagline, like fashion houses in Paris, you've got Paris, Milan, we go now, Bogota, Yangon, Nairobi, Beijing, Sao Paulo, London, Brussels, Geneva, in terms of where we have staff. We are actually working very hard to become a South-South organisation. So the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, with our partners from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, who are also here today, is in a way a precursor, I think, of other sort of regional centres around the world to make this stuff a reality. And I'm often asked what a success indicator looks like. A success indicator for me would be when Brazil and India negotiate their bilateral trade agreement in 5 years' time. That has nothing to do with any EU country or the OECD. Will human rights and labour rights be on the table when those bilateral trade agreements are put in place? That's an indicator. That's a performance indicator for my organisation. We also work thematically on 4 sectors which we see as instrumental to all others. The finance sector, and Herman and I were in Thun last week with a bunch of banks discussing the role of the finance sector as instrumental in terms of the guiding principles. The ICT sector, I was in Helsinki yesterday with the Global E-Sustainability Initiative, a lot of the ICT companies. Recruitment we look at because it moves workers, and if there's one sector in this world that has probably the biggest impact on human rights globally, it is the global recruitment sector, I would say. And then commodities, energy, and mining. Now, across all of these sectors, of course, due diligence is critical, and understanding human rights risks and impacts is core to mission. And really today I just want to raise 2 points, which reminds me I should be doing my PowerPoint slides. Yeah, I knew this would happen. Here we go. I want to raise 2 issues, scope and quality. Scope and quality. Now, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were agreed in June 2011. We're here to mark the 3-year date. And I would say that there are a number of achievements that the Guiding Principles put in place, and they're on the slide. Universal political consensus does not happen very often in the UN. It happens even less in the Human Rights Council. And to have not just the major international powers, but also the key emerging economies agree on a framework, which for the first time in human history gives non-state actors, corporations, a direct responsibility in international law, not legally binding, but also not voluntary. That is an achievement. The GPs also remind us that the central duty remains with the state. The duty to protect all rights in relation to the abuses caused by others, including by businesses, is primarily and fundamentally a government duty. And therefore, this is not a CSR framework. In the old-fashioned word definition of CSR, this is a governance framework. It's a political science framework, to follow on from what Giuseppe said earlier. Now, this move beyond voluntarism, yet this is not binding. This is an issue that's come up again, and I'm not going to talk about it in the speech, but several of you in the audience will know that the government of Ecuador has put forward a proposal at the UN at the moment that's going to be discussed in Geneva this month about whether government should be moving towards a binding treaty on business and human rights or not. And I have a view on that. I'm agnostic to some extent. I think possibly there's room and need for that. It depends what the focus is. But the fundamental point for today is it's not an alternative to the UN Guiding Principles. We mustn't set up the UN Guiding Principles as an alternative to a binding treaty and say we don't need any further conventions because we have the guiding principles. John Ruggie and everybody else involved were very clear that the guiding principles are a foundational document for everybody in this room, regardless of where you think business and human rights is or should go. Not an alternative to anything else. And so I think that's important. I mean, our view is the guiding principles opens many doors, it doesn't close any. It also puts a strong focus on prevention as well as remedy. Now, remedy is a long-standing human rights principle, it's key and core, but prevention is an import from health and safety and more recently anti-corruption laws. We shouldn't wait for bad things to happen. Huh? But then, of course, it raises the issue of how much prevention. How do we know when we've done enough? And this critical question then of thresholds of adequacy. Whilst human rights might be seen as absolutes constrained by each other, due diligence is not. Due diligence costs time, it costs money, it needs to be prioritized. Every business in this room has to make pragmatic decisions about where to focus due diligence, as was the case in health and safety terms 30 years ago. We are in a very similar position, and let's just remind ourselves health and safety is a human rights issue, the right to life, the right to health. So we've done it for health and safety. The challenge is to do it for other human rights. And I suppose the last thing to say is the guiding principles shifts discussions around risk and impact from business-centric discussions, sphere of influence discussions, to human-centric discussions. And if there's one thing that a human rights approach to risk needs to embody, it is human risk. Human at the center of the risk analysis, not the business itself. Those things can coalesce, of course, social license to operate, etc. In the medium to long term means those two things often converge, but in the short term, sometimes they do not. Now, here we go. On to scope. The first of my two questions. If we take the second pillar of the UN guiding principles around the corporate responsibility to respect, if I'm in the elevator and there's 30 seconds to explain it, then arguably it can be boiled down to 4 questions. First, how much knowledge does my company need to have about its actual and possible human rights risks and impacts? Given that the acquisition of knowledge through due diligence takes time, money and resources, companies have to prioritize, and how to decide on issues such as scope, materiality and priority. How to act on this knowledge is the second question. You gain the knowledge, how do you act on it? How much mitigation, how much prevention? Now, we have to remember that, up until quite recently, there wasn't a business case for acquiring knowledge in human rights terms. If anything, companies would try and shield their CEOs from the knowledge of negative impacts and risks. The UN guiding principles, quite radically, I would say, is switching that through 180 degrees and saying there's now an a priori expectation that you acquire knowledge and you act on that knowledge. The third question is transparency. How transparent should you be about the knowledge and then how you've acted on it, the knowing and showing? And whilst transparency is the default, I think we should all admit today that full transparency on every type of impact and risk is not always in human rights interests as well as business interests. Sometimes you might endanger rights holders by being too transparent. We'll come back to that question. The last question, of course, is remedies, fundamental. Bad things will still happen to good companies. Good companies will still make mistakes. There will still be victims of human rights abuses. No risk can be eliminated completely. In fact, arguably, business risk and to some extent human risk is an essential component of business and business decision making. So adequate remedies are essential, and businesses have a key role to play in the provision of site-level grievance mechanisms and other types of remedy. Now, if we accept that these are some of the challenges, then the first question then of scope comes into play here. How do we know how much due diligence is enough? I'm sure that it's a question you've all asked yourselves, and maybe I'll just contribute some thoughts to that question. First, can any business determine the scope and prioritization of human rights due diligence it needs to carry out on its own, or does it need to involve stakeholders and rights holders in that decision? Is scope a business-only decision? Second, history perhaps teaches us that thresholds of reasonableness in terms of how much due diligence cannot be set by business alone. If a business does take actions on its own without involving outside stakeholders, when push comes to shove, when stakeholders feel aggrieved, they will not defend the threshold. And sometimes competitors will even testify against a company for falling below industry standards, or the OECD national contact points will issue public statements criticising the business for its actions or inactions. These thresholds will clearly have to be set in diverse ways depending on the business sector, the geography, the associated human rights risks. Sometimes such standards of performance can be set through multi-stakeholder initiatives, in other cases government legislation, in other cases economic or financial levers, such as the export credit agencies, international financial institutions, public procurement. Maybe they'd be more effective in some cases. In other cases, the private sector itself will be able to set clear expectations through a diverse range of business relationships, including supply chain codes, licensing agreements, franchising, mergers and acquisition processes, etc. The point I'm stressing, in other words, is how much due diligence is enough is a context-specific question. How deep and how wide? There can be no generic answer across all business sectors. And the reality is it will take time for the question to be asked and effectively answered in different contexts. It is right that we focus on the high-risk context first, and that due diligence bar is set as high as possible in contexts where human rights risk is high. Let's take the example of Burma, Myanmar, where we have a centre. We publicly applauded Coca-Cola for setting a very high due diligence bar in terms of its selection of its local Burmese business partner. We don't always come out and condemn or acknowledge good practice, but we do occasionally when it has wider policy implications. Coke had to do that to some extent because the US has a mandatory reporting requirement, but it didn't have to be as comprehensive in its due diligence as it was. What will happen in the next few months and years if European competitors of Coke undercut that? What if any European company does less due diligence about its selection of a partner in Burma? And let's remind ourselves that the Burmese military also have significant military holdings in the country. There's no requirement of European companies to do or to report on their due diligence as there is for US companies in the context of Burma. So what I'll say that even amongst OECD nations, we're a long way from a level playing field in terms of due diligence expectations, even in high-risk countries such as Burma. Now, within the finance sector, for example, it's a key enabling sector, as we've already said. There are many dialogues of which human rights is now part. This ranges from discussions between national export credit agencies to international finance institutions, the Equator Principles, the UNEP Finance Initiative, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. A number of national contact points have also mediated and made statements in relation to financing under the OECD guidelines, and this includes the Dutch National Contact Point. So last week I was in Thun in Switzerland. ING Group is one of the 7 banks in that process, looking at how the UN guiding principles can be applied in the finance sector. I think it's good that the finance sector is working closely now. There are many initiatives, I've listed some of them. The challenge, of course, is for those initiatives to become increasingly multi-stakeholder. Because if what I've said is true, and that thresholds of due diligence have to be acknowledged by other stakeholders, they need to be involved. Let's take another example, the electronic sector. For many years, the major issue was primarily labour rights in the supply chain. Then came the issue of conflict minerals, another supply chain issue. Big debate now in Europe as to whether we should have a Dodd-Frank Act for conflict minerals. At the moment, we seem to have Dodd-Frank Light being proposed. Why does Europe expect a lower standard than the US in terms of reporting on conflict minerals? Maybe you know the answer to that question better than I do. But again, we have a plethora of initiatives: the Electronics Industry Code of Conduct, the Global E-Sustainability Initiative, the Global Network Initiative, the Industry Dialogue of Telcos, etc. But the Edward Snowden revelations have pushed all of these initiatives into what I would say are existentialist challenges around right to privacy, data transfer, mass surveillance, and even protection from hate speech. These are very real dilemmas for these companies, and I would say that these companies are in a bit of a no-win position between the expectations of governments or the expectations of foreign ministries and security ministries of the same government. Again, we highly recommend the position that Vodafone has taken over the recent days. It's the first telco to issue a transparency report, and for the first time, it's the first telco to say that there are governments around the world that are plugging directly into networks. Vodafone can't list the governments, but it's out there, and we welcome this greater transparency. We didn't agree with Vodafone a few years ago in terms of the shutdown in Egypt, but we do agree that Vodafone is now in a leadership position on transparency and should be acknowledged as such. This issue then of coherence, I mean, the Dutch National Action Plan raises the issue of coherence for the Dutch government in terms of policy, but I would argue that for Pillars 2 and Pillar 3, we should look to the business sector itself to be coherent in terms of how it helps set a level playing field in due diligence terms. Now I'm going to conclude really with my last slide here, which is 10 considerations on quality. So if we've talked about some of the dilemmas of scope, there are also dilemmas of quality in terms of risk and impact. And hopefully we can come back to some of these during the discussions of the day. The challenge we have is that John Ruggie ran out of time to some extent in terms of Pillar 2. There is no quality, well, in my view anyway, it might not be his, but there is no quality control mechanism for what is good due diligence. If we ask ourselves what is a good remedy, there are 7 principles in Pillar 3, effectiveness criteria, in terms of what a good remedy looks like, or should accord to. For due diligence there isn't, and to some extent it's been left to the marketplace, to consultancies and law firms and others, to answer the question of what good looks like. I think it's a challenge for all of us, and when we look at food and agriculture, textiles, finance, retail and electronics, what does good look like in terms of risk assessment? I propose 10 quality questions. The first is the assessment. Does it include all human rights, a priori? And does it put the human at the centre of the equation? What is the purpose of the assessment? Whose interests will it benefit? Why is it being done? The second question is, are we talking about real risks or potential risks? Actual impacts or potential impacts? Maybe both, but clarity in terms of what is being measured. The third point I've already touched on is risk to people and risk to company are both different things. Does the assessment look at both? Critically, human risk has to be part of the equation for it to be in line with the guiding principles. Involvement of affected rights holders. Does the assessment clearly separate out the impacted rights holders from other stakeholders? How are rights holders consulted about the assessment? How are their views incorporated? Are they able to influence the design of the assessment itself? Quality question 5 is the question of scope, which we've already talked about. If I've said that all human rights need to be considered a priori, quickly a business has to get to an issue of materiality, of human rights salience. Which are those few rights upon which I have the biggest impact and therefore I need to really focus on? That is inevitable that businesses need to do that. But do they answer that question on their own? Do they answer it in relation to their whole sector? And do they answer it in relation to the key stakeholders and rights holders upon which that sector impacts? Is the answer different from Burma than it is for Kenya or Colombia in terms of what rights are germane to the assessment? The scope question, of course, how that is answered is critical. Question 6, quality question 6, avoid labels and silos. There's often this complex discussion about whether a company should do a human rights impact assessment or whether a social and environmental impact assessment is fit for purpose. Let's avoid the sort of labelling tautology. Companies will also say, is water a human rights issue? We look at water in our environmental assessment, so we don't need to look at it in our human rights assessment, do we? Again, this is siloing. We would say, take the example of agriculture, that water is both an environmental issue and a human rights issue. In fact, there's no such thing as human rights issues. Human rights is an approach, we would say, to any issue. And therefore water needs to be looked both at as a human right as well as an environmental impact issue. And therefore siloing this within a company or between an ESIA or a human rights impact assessment is not always helpful. Number 7, the role of the state. Assessing the role of government is critical to any human rights impact assessment. The effectiveness of applying laws, the judiciary, corruption. These are very, very sensitive issues. And I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes human rights impact assessments can't be fully disclosed. In fact, there are not that many in the public domain. There are reasons why some aspects of impact assessment, good human rights impact assessment, have to be kept confidential because they are way too sensitive for a company to release. However, I would say the default towards greater disclosure should be there, and there is a lack of disclosing methodology. One of the problems about the lack of methodological disclosure is that because so many consultancies and law firms and others, who I love of course, have a stake in developing methodologies, there are commercial interests involved in non-disclosure which are not really helping us. So greater transparency on the methodology would help us all, I think, in answering the quality question. So 8, transparency and disclosure. I think I've covered that. Methodological coherence requires greater sharing of methodology. 9, implementation and link to a grievance mechanism. Impacts and risks need to be incorporated into companies, but can also, grievance mechanisms themselves can also provide very important data about where risk lies. Do you feed back the intelligence from a grievance mechanism into your risk assessment? And the final point, oversight and review. Large projects perhaps can benefit from having independent oversight mechanisms. And we've seen a few of those in the past, but not so many. Now I hope these thoughts are useful in our discussions for today. And I'd be very happy to take any questions or to any controversy that I've raised this morning. I think we have made some progress, some very good progress over the past 3 years, but the challenge of implementation really lies ahead of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.